Welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Tuesday, June 25th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Deion. He had an interesting conversation with Joel Klatt, where they unpacked a ton of stuff. His relationship with Nick Saban, the way he's going about building his roster, his future at Colorado, which is a big question mark about him. So we'll get into all of that and break down all of the comments that he made. Then we'll get into roster building overall. Obviously, Deion is one side of the spectrum going all the way into the portal, but there's the other side of the spectrum going all the way into high school like Clemson is. So we'll figure out kind of which side is better, which side is the way to go, and how that could possibly change over the next couple of years. So that'll definitely be a very interesting thing to follow over the next couple of years. Then we'll get into kind of an interesting segment. I feel like every single year in college football, we have a certain group of people in every conference that decides the conference, whether it's quarterbacks or head coaches or offensive coordinators sometimes. There's tons of people that go into winning a conference, but it feels like one group in particular tends to separate themselves. And I kind of want to break down which group I think defines each big conference this year. Then we'll get into Heisman talk. We did this yesterday with the SEC. We're going to go over to the Big Ten and knock out them today as well. Then we'll get into a Top 10 Tuesday, and this one is going to be controversial. The one last week I felt like was going to be very controversial with the atmospheres. This one might be more so. I'm doing the best rivalries in college football as I see it. I'll do a top 10 list, and it is not an easy list to make, so give me a little bit of leeway, I hope. But at the end of the day, very, very fun list to make. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of comments and questions throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. But I can also see the chats on the side, so if you want to leave anything in there, more than welcome to do that as well. But if you do want to leave a tip and donation, gsmcpodcast.net is that website. But let's jump right in. And let's talk about Deion Sanders, because he had a very, very interesting conversation with Joel Klatt. As we've talked about on here, I feel like we've broke down a number of different things that have been said in these interviews, but Joel Klatt is making his way around the country, and he's talking to a bunch of different big-time head coaches. We talked about Steve Sarkisian. We've talked about Sherrone Moore in the past when he talked to him, but this time around, it was Coach Sanders, it was Deion, and it was a very, very interesting conversation. They unpacked just so many different things, from his relationship to Nick Saban, to his future at Colorado, to just what happened last season and what he learned about himself. And that's kind of where I want to start here, because I think there is, obviously, last year did not go the way that Deion expected it to go. He's a very confident guy. He came into that season thinking they were going to do really big-time things, and it didn't necessarily work out that way. They started 3-0 with a win over TCU, who was just coming off a national title win. They went on, beat Nebraska fairly comfortably. That was a closer game than the scoreboard showed, but at the end of the day, won that game, barely beat a really interesting Colorado State team, which is another team to watch this upcoming season, frankly. But then things kind of went awry. They got dominated by Oregon. They got dominated by I'm blanking on the team that they played next. It might have just been USC, so they didn't get dominated there. But there were a number of games throughout the end of the season where they didn't have that extra thing, whatever that is. Dominance on the offensive and defensive line was obviously a huge hole. That extra oomph to say, we're going to win this game where it's really close, one possession, and that's really where they lost the majority of their games. There were 5 losses on their schedule that were 7 points or less. So it really gives you an idea of kind of how close this team was, but also where the holes are. They're not necessarily easy to patch by any means. The offensive and defensive line are comfortably the hardest positions on a roster to rebuild, because they got to work together, and it's really, really tough to do that, especially walking into a conference that it's not going to be quite as physical as the SEC or the Big Ten, but there's plenty of teams in the Big 12 that are plenty capable of pushing some guys around. But also, he said he learned a lot. He said he knew that he had to go after the trenches. He knew that they had to do some different things to compete at a high level, and through the portal, he did a lot of those things. Obviously, we don't know what that'll look like on the field, but he had a lot of really, really talented players, especially edge rushers and offensive linemen, that will definitely be starters and big-time players for Colorado this upcoming season. The other thing he talked about is Joe Klatt in the past, and probably the past 2 weeks. I think he was on Colin Cowherd's show when he said this, but he said that he thinks Colorado can compete for a Big 12 title and possibly make it to the playoff. Deion obviously agreed because that's something that he had promised before the season started. That's what he expects to happen. And that's part of what makes him kind of who he is, right? That confidence, that unwavering confidence is a pretty special thing, to be totally honest with you. So I've talked about this a lot on here before. I don't think this is a team that can currently win the Big 12. At least this year, I think there's too many quality teams ahead of them. I think there's teams that are really solid at the positions that they're not so solid at. And I think it's going to be just a couple of matchups where they just get overpowered and just get beat. So it's not to say that they can't win this conference. Obviously, with the 5-1 possession games last year, you're always going to have a shot to flip a couple of things around, get a couple of different, bounce a ball type plays, and make your way up that win total. And I think that's what they will do this season. But I think it'll be a little bit more modest than some people are suggesting. I think they could get to 8 wins. I think they could get to maybe even 9, possibly. But the way I'm looking at it right now, they're probably a 7-5, maybe an 8-4 team. At least that's the way that I look at it. If the offensive line is very much improved, then that conversation gets a little bit different. I'm just a little bit more skeptical of what the offensive line is going to look like. And then he talked about a little bit about kind of his mission at Colorado and what he wants to be at Colorado. One of the big things that I took away, one of the comments that he made, they were talking about the book that he's most recently written, and in the book he says, you will remember me as, the guy that played in the NFL and the MLB, the guy that played in a World Series game and the Super Bowl in the same, all this incredible stuff that is in his past. But he says you will remember in the future as Coach Prime. That's the way that he wants to be remembered around the football landscape, and there's a real chance for that to happen. The thing is, that could happen for the worse or it could happen for the better, right? The next couple of years could be a little bit disastrous up there at Colorado, and he could leave on kind of some bad terms. Some things could go wrong, and we remember Coach Sanders, but it's not necessarily the Coach Sanders that he wants us to remember. Now, obviously, that could go the entirely opposite direction. And he also kind of talked about the desire for him to put his players first and to kind of give them, whatever they need to be successful, and for them to walk out of the doors, better than they walked in, whatever that looks like for them. And I think this is something that there tends to be somewhat of a disconnect between the public about Deion and the way that he views his players and the people in that program or the people around that program and the way that he views his players. I can say with absolute confidence he cares about his players. I can say with absolute confidence that he wants those guys to succeed on and off the field. Now, he is a little bit more intense. That's just the way that he is. He is a professional football player that is back down in the college ranks, and these guys are professional athletes. It's one of those harsh realities that college athletes in general, but especially college football athletes, are going to have to get used to, where when you ask to be paid and you want to get NIL money and possible revenue sharing and all of these different things that are happening, you're going to be treated like professional athletes. And that comes with, being a little bit more blunt between the head coach and the players, and, maybe asking you to leave a program that you would absolutely love to be at, but you're not good enough to play at. And all of that is obviously really, really tough for the players to deal with. And it's not necessarily what we want in this sport, but you can't necessarily ask to be professional athletes and then get mad when you're treated like professional athletes, is I guess the point that I'm trying to make. So I understand that everyone is very, very divided on the way that Deion handles things, and frankly, I am too. I don't necessarily love all of the different things that he's done since he showed up. I didn't necessarily love the "I'm bringing my Louis with me" type of comment, but the reality is some of that is just what college football is at this point. It is a professional sport, and these kids are going to get treated a little bit more like professionals. But The final point he made and the final thing I want to touch on is first just his confidence in what he's doing, and then kind of his plan for the future at Colorado. And the biggest thing is obviously the roster building. When you talk about Colorado, it always starts with the transfer portal. We're always wondering, what is this team going to look like next year, and how many new players are going to come in. I mean, he essentially turned over the entirety of the roster in 2 years. He added, I think, 84 different transfer guys over the last 2 years, and that's almost an entire roster. So it's just incredible what he's been able to do through the portal, but the question is, does that work? Is that sustainable? Is that a winning way of going about business? And he said time and again, he fully believes that that's the case. And one of the reasons that I'm a little bit more on board, I suppose, with the way that he's thinking than I was before is the coaching staff he has is almost entirely, not entirely, but a lot of NFL guys, over 100 years of NFL coaching experience on that staff. And that gives you a little bit more of ability to do this type of roster construction where you're bringing in new guys every single year, and there is a little bit of that free agency type vibe. Now, it's a little bit different at the NFL level, but at the end of the day, NFL coaches are a little bit more equipped to make those relationships a little bit faster and get to developing these guys a little bit faster. Now, the big difference is you're not getting that finished product that you usually get at the NFL level, but you're still getting a really good player, at least in most of these scenarios, and you have coaches that understand what it's like to have a guy thrown into the mix and you have to coach him right away. And then finally, he talked about the elephant in the room, which is his future at Colorado. Everyone wonders if, once Shadur leaves and once Shiloh leaves and Travis leaves, is he gone as well? He says he is absolutely staying. He wants to dominate there. He said that very, very confidently. And frankly, I believe him for the time being. And just for the time being, I'll be totally honest. I don't necessarily think that he has any immediate plans to find his way out. I don't think right now he's looking at this as a stepping stone job. The thing about that is, what happens if in 24 or 25 or 26 he has a big time year where they win 10 games, maybe win the conference, go to the playoff? There's going to be some people calling that are just going to be really, really hard to turn down. So I don't necessarily think he's lying by any means, but I do think circumstances will change, and I think he likely will not be at Colorado for too much longer. But at the end of the day, he's there right now, and I think he'll be there for at least the next couple of years. And the interesting thing here is, I think 2024 is going to be probably a 7 to 8 win season, and that'll be really, really good considering everything. Some people will say it's not so good, but it is really, really good if you're talking about the entire enchilada over there at Boulder. But the reality is, I think when I look at this team, 2026 is the year that I'm pointing at, because after 2024, you lose Shadur Sanders, you lose some of the guys that played such a huge part in building this team up right now. And then you have to replace your quarterback. You have to replace some of the offensive linemen you brought in, some of the defensive linemen. You have to replace a lot of stuff. But then 2026, you might have a little bit more stability. Jordan Seaton will be a junior at that point. I think that's a year where we could really see Colorado make some noise. But if it were, up to Deion, he would make noise immediately and every single year. And he has the chance to do that this year. There's no two ways about that. Every time I hear this guy talk, I get a little bit more confident in what he's brewing over there. Now, to be totally fair, I was very, very low on the confidence meter in terms of building a winning product out there. But at the end of the day, he knows what he wants. He has full confidence. He has a very clear vision. Will it work? I tend to say no, but who knows? He knows a lot more about football than I know, so I'm not necessarily one to bash the way that he's going about business. But I do want to talk about that in the next segment, because I think there's been some sentiment around college football that the transfer portal is the way to build a football team and it is the way to build a winner, and I don't necessarily fully agree, and I want to break down why I don't agree and why I think high school recruiting is still the way to build a winning program going forward, at least for the next little bit right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Deion and his comments with Joel Klatt that had a ton to unpack about his future at Colorado, the way he's building his team, his relationship with his son and his players, everything in between. So that was a really, really fun thing to break down. But let's get into the roster building conversation that Colorado kind of started in college football, where Deion came into the party and said, we are going to build through the portal. That's just the way it's going to be. He has essentially flipped that entire roster over in 2 years through the portal, and it's been a really, really interesting thing to watch, and it's kind of started a conversation around college football where you wonder, what is the right way to go about recruiting? You know, is it through the portal, or is it, still high school recruiting? Is it still going bare bones and finding the guys from the high school level and developing them throughout their years? And this really started for me, Michael Bratton, or you might know him as SEC Mike on Twitter or something like that. He was on the Three Man Front podcast, and he was talking about Auburn and Hugh Freeze. And one of the big conversations, obviously, around Hugh Freeze, whenever he comes up in conversation, is the way that he, is going about business at Auburn. And there's a lot of questions about the different ways that he's kind of employing different strategies, I suppose. And he had just a number of bad takes about the way that Hugh Freeze is going about business. And there's no disrespect to SEC Mike. He makes tons of incredible content, but this was a rough couple of minutes for him. But he was talking about the way that Auburn has gone about roster building, and that's the one that I really want to zero in on. But there were a number that I didn't really fully agree with. First of all, he started this rant with a number of different takes about Hugh Freeze, but he started saying that they should have brought in a transfer quarterback this offseason. Obviously, they are rolling with Peyton Thorne. I think that was a good decision, frankly. I think they were more than a quarterback away. They had plenty to deal with before they got to that level of SEC play. So I think it was better to use your money in other directions and then maybe go find a quarterback next offseason if you need to. So I didn't necessarily fully agree with that one, but kind of understood where he was coming from. He also said that he doesn't think Hugh Freeze is that good of a coach because his entire reputation is built off these 2 Bama wins back in the day. Frankly, that's a really good reputation. If you can beat that Bama team any 2 times throughout that the reign that they had, it's remarkable. There's no two ways about that. I understand that he hasn't necessarily won a national title or gone to a playoff or done some of the things that some other big-time coaches in the country have done, but that doesn't mean that this dude isn't remarkable. That doesn't mean that this dude doesn't have the ability to make some noise in this conference and absolutely can be someone that finds his way up to the kind of top echelon of this conference with Auburn. But the one that I want to spend time on is the roster construction one, because that was by far the worst take that he had. And the take essentially was, he said, the way that he said he thinks that the way that Auburn is going about business with roster construction is the wrong way. He said building through high school is something that you could have done 4 or 5 years ago, but now you got to do the portal. The portal is the only way to build a winning team, and man, could he not be more wrong. Obviously, Colorado is the magnum opus of portal building. That's the way that they go about business. There have been other teams that have leaned into that a little bit more. USC early on in the Lincoln Riley days. Michigan State when Mel Tucker took over there. We've talked about those a little bit. Those were 10-win teams that didn't win their conference, so gives you a little bit of an idea of what the ceiling is on those. But there are 2 teams this year that absolutely could kind of change that conversation a little bit, and they're Ole Miss and Oregon in my my eyes. So when you look at these teams and you look at kind of what they can do this upcoming season, we'll start with Ole Miss and break down why I understand why that argument kind of holds water here, but it's not necessarily the argument that I think everyone is trying to make, I suppose. So Ole Miss obviously went to the portal for the majority of their starters this upcoming year. There is going to be so many guys across that defense that absolutely are coming in and probably going to start for 1 year or 2 years and then find their way into the NFL or maybe off to another program possibly. But the reality is they leaned on the portal very aggressively. There's no two ways about that. That being said, they leaned on the portal aggressively to build up their high school recruiting. The SEC is a world where you have to recruit at a really, really high level in the high school level if you want to compete. You know, Georgia, Alabama, they're always in the top 5. Texas is starting to find their way always into the top 5. LSU is going to have great classes. You have to compete with those teams, and Ole Miss, or Lane Kiffin more in particular, saw a team when he walked in that wasn't nearly close to where they needed to be to compete for this conference. So he went out and got some portal guys. He got Jackson Dart first, he got Trey Harris, he got some of the guys that have come in throughout the time. And then this past offseason, obviously, it went gangbusters. He added absolutely everyone. But all of this is to set themselves up to be a team where high school kids look at them and say, that's a program I want to play for. As of right now, Ole Miss is pretty far down on the list when you're talking about SEC schools and recruits in general. But Lane Kiffin is starting to change that because of the way he's used the portal and because of the way they're playing on the field because of that path. So it's not necessarily that he is using the portal to build his program. He's using the portal to build a team that then can propel him, I suppose, into the roster construction of high school recruiting. At least that's the way that I view it. I could be wrong. He could continue this path and continue bringing in 35 transfer portal guys every single year. But as of right now, I mean, their high school recruiting is getting much better every single year, and it feels like Ole Miss is setting up a path where they can slowly start to wane back on the amount of transfers that they're bringing in, but they need to do it from the outset to create the team that, you know, garners interest from the high school ranks. And then Oregon is kind of the opposite, a little bit different than what Ole Miss has to offer. The O-line at Oregon, 3 of the 5 starters are high school recruits, including the most important guy on the roster or on the offensive line for them, Josh Connerly. They also have Terrence Ferguson, the starting tight end, Jordan James, the starting running back, are high school guys. Huge positions for new quarterbacks coming in, which is something they've become pretty accustomed to up there in Eugene. The defense has tons of new transfer starters, but when you look at the depth, it's almost entirely high school kids. And also, when you look at the heart and soul and the communicator of that defense, Jeffrey Bassa, he's a high school recruit. So I think there's more players on Oregon that they are kind of the foundation that you build on, where you can bring in 25 transfer portal guys, but the really only way you can do that and be entirely successful, you know, be national championship successful the way Oregon wants to be, is if you have that foundation of really good players before them. And also on top of that, they're doing kind of the same thing that Ole Miss is doing, where you bring in a guy like Bo Nix a year ago and recruiting really starts to ramp up. Now you have Dylan Gabriel. If you put together another really good year, the recruiting is going to get absolutely insane out there. I mean, it really already has, to be totally honest with you, adding guys like Elijah Rushing and Gatlin Bear this past offseason. But the reality is, this is a program that they're not using the portal to win national titles. Well, they are this year. I don't mean to say that they're not trying to win a national title this year. What I mean to say is, they're using the portal as a means to get a better high school recruiting standpoint. They're using the portal as a means to put together a really good team for a year and then move forward from there as a high school driven team. At least that's the way that I view it. It could be that, you know, maybe they win big and they continue down this path. But as I see it right now, both these schools are really leaning into trying to make sure their high school recruiting is as strong as possible, but the top line guys are transfer guys to let those high school guys develop, and then you bring them in and slowly start to tamper down the transfer guys. So it's a very interesting conversation. It could be something that changes very drastically this upcoming year, where you could have Colorado make a run. You could have one of these two teams make a run, and then you see some other teams, some bigger teams, possibly poke their nose a little bit more into the transfer portal world than in the past. But when you look at the rosters that stand out, opposed from these two, and there's another one in here that I'd like to throw in, actually. But Ohio State, Georgia, and Texas, in my opinion, are the three best rosters in the country. I think Oregon could absolutely have an argument over Texas. So those are kind of splitting hairs. But regardless, those are three rosters that sit on the mountaintop. In terms of rosters around the country, Bama is also kind of in that conversation. And when you look at Ohio State, Georgia, and Texas, almost every big-time player on that team is going to be a high school recruit. Now, obviously, some have utilized some transfer portal guys in different capacities, but Texas and UGA, the entire offensive line is high school recruits. They are building that entire thing. The majority of the defense are high school kids. Position groups they have leaned on, obviously, like Texas at wide receiver. UGA and Texas went out and got some D linemen. Obviously, they've utilized it in different parts, but it's been patching holes. It's not been, recreating a team and recreating an entire roster. It's been saying we have a really good structure here, but, there's a little bit of a hole that's leaking water right over there that we could just tape over with a transfer this year and then let the high school guys kind of come into the picture. So this is going to be a developing conversation. My take in a little bit could be totally different than it is right now, but as of right now, I have no problem with what Hugh Freeze is doing over at Auburn. Frankly, I think it's the right way to go about business. Bringing in guys like Walker White are going to be the guys that change your program. There's going to be guys in the process that you bring in from the transfer portal that slingshot you in that direction, but at the end of the day, those are going to be the guys that you remember as your program builders. I think when we look at the history of the portal teams, 2021 USC, or 2022 USC, 2021 Michigan State, you can build a successful team through the portal. There's no doubt in my mind. You can build a successful team that can make some plays. I don't think you can build a successful program. And I think Ole Miss knows that, and I think that's why they're recruiting hard. I think Oregon knows that, and that's why they're recruiting hard. And that's also the reason that I don't think Colorado is capable of building a big-time program that competes year and year and year over. So it's going to be an interesting battle to kind of watch happen over the next couple of years. But at the end of the day, I think if you're not building out of high school, you don't have a shot to build a Bama or a Georgia or even a Clemson from a couple of years ago. You don't have that ability because at my estimation, high school recruiting is still the bedrock of building a roster in college football. So it'll be really interesting to watch that develop. Maybe I'm entirely wrong in 3 years and everything is through the portal, but as of right now, I'm leaning in the direction of Kirby Smart and Ryan Day and the guys that have built rosters that are a lot of high school kids with, some patchwork here and there. So I definitely lean way more towards the high school world in that realm, but at the end of the day, it'll be really interesting to watch that develop over the next couple of years. But let's take our second break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about some groups that will define different conferences. We always have some groups that kind of separate themselves in every conference and kind of decide the conference overall, whether that's a certain position, a certain coaching staff position, whatever that looks like. It'll be really interesting to watch that develop this year, but I have my picks for the ones that I think will define each conference right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Apologies for that, but welcome back, everyone. We just talked about some of the different conversations around roster construction. Is it better to go through the portal? Is it better to go through high school? I tend to lean high school, but there's definitely some debate that will be happening over the next little bit around that topic. But what I want to get into now is the groups that will define each conference, and I want to start with the SEC. To me, it's the quarterbacks, and it's not even a question. They just have dudes all over the place. There are so many guys that can be just real difference makers at the quarterback position, and they always have dudes. You know, they had the Heisman winner a year ago, but this year it's a little bit different because it feels like they have tons of really, really good players, but there's not this huge separation necessarily between the players going into the season. So I kind of want to break down the quote-unquote tiers as I see it, but also just the remarkable amount of guys that can make some noise this year. To me, it starts with Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers. Those are the guys that are at the top of the list, in my opinion. Those are the guys that will likely be at the peak of this conference for most of the season, if I had to imagine. It could be totally different story coming out of the season, but going in, those are the two guys that I'm putting at the very top of the mountaintop right now. Then you get into some guys like Jalen Milroe, Graham Mertz, Jackson Dart, Peyton Thorne, Brady Cook, these kind of these kind of veteran presences that absolutely will play good football. You know, some could play really great football like Jalen Milroe or Jackson Dart. Graham Mertz is someone that is a little bit interesting this upcoming year. Brady Cook, another one that could absolutely make a jump and get Missouri into the playoff. Peyton Thorne will likely be a little bit lower on this list, but still could play some really good football and definitely shock some people this upcoming season. So some really remarkable quarterbacks there that all have done really good things throughout their career. But then you got the kind of fresher faces to the party, I suppose. You have Nico Iamaleava, Brock Vandegrift, Jackson Arnold, Connor Wegman, Garrett Nussmeier. There are so many dudes to break down, and I think all of these dudes are just remarkably talented. I think the arm talent in that group in particular is just insane, to be totally honest with you. I cannot wait to see what these guys can do this upcoming season because I think it could be pretty special if I'm being totally honest. And then you get to kind of the wild cards of the group, and they're not bad quarterbacks by any means. You have Lenora Sellers, who I think is going to be a very, very interesting guy to watch this year. I don't necessarily think South Carolina is going to be all that great, but I think that kid's going to be really, really good. And then you have, Diego Pavia, Blake Shapen coming over from Baylor into Mississippi State, and I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch as well because that was a pretty good quarterback over there at Baylor for quite some time, and going into an offense that is very quarterback-friendly, maybe Mississippi State makes some noise. Who knows? And then you have Taylon Green down at Arkansas, who is one of those guys that I think is good for at least one game where you turn on the TV and Arkansas is beating someone they're not supposed to be beating, and it's because Taylon Green is putting up just crazy numbers. So the SEC is going to have elite defenses. They're going to have elite offenses. They're going to have big-time teams all across the place. But I think the separator is going to be the quarterback play. Whoever has the best quarterback in the conference, I think will likely win the conference. Whoever, puts their quarterback in the best position, which is kind of an offensive coordinator, head coaching type job, will likely be in the best position. But quarterback is always the most important position on the field, but in the SEC, it just feels that much more important, to be totally honest with you, especially this year. But then let's move over to the Big Ten, and the group that I have defining this conference this upcoming year is the trenches. And this is no secret to any Big Ten fan. That is the way that the Big Ten works. If you win the line of scrimmage, you likely win a lot of games in that conference. So it'll be really interesting to watch this kind of unfold because obviously you're adding some new teams to the mix. USC, Washington, UCLA, maybe they're not quite as ready for the physicality. It seems like Oregon is, at least on paper, but we'll find out, I suppose, when they finally take the field. Obviously, you start this conversation with Oregon and Ohio State whenever you talk about the Big Ten, and both of those have really good line of scrimmage play. Obviously, Ohio State's offensive line is a little bit of a worry. There's some worry around Oregon's defensive line, although I think the front line of that is really, really talented and will be more than fine. And then you got Michigan and Penn State, who both are going to be really good on the offensive line because they have been for the past, however many years. So I think when you look at the top end of this conference, when you look at the teams that will likely win this conference at the end of the day, that's where their team starts, is in the trenches and winning those battles at the line of scrimmage. So it'll be really interesting to watch. But also, when you look at kind of the dark horse teams in the conference, Nebraska, Iowa, you could also include USC in here, but they don't necessarily have the trenches that the other two do. They're going to be really strong at the D-line and the O-line, and it's going to give them the ability to compete with some of these big-time teams that maybe they weren't able to a couple of years ago, or maybe some of the new teams coming in aren't able to, so they have a little bit of an opening there. So obviously, it's going to be a huge part of the conversation. Running backs are a huge part of what they do in the Big Ten, and frankly, when you look across the Big Ten, the running back group is just absolutely insane, and you need movement at the line of scrimmage if you're going to be able to win football games. Frankly, the way I said, whoever has the best quarterback play in the SEC will win that conference. I think whoever has the most yards before contact rushing the ball will win the Big Ten. I know that sounds kind of like a very niche thing to talk about, but the more push that an offensive line gets and the least amount push that a D-line gets for any specific team will likely win this conference, because you open up so many running lanes for running backs that are just remarkable in that conference this upcoming year. So the trenches, I think, will definitely define the Big Ten this upcoming year, but the Big 12, it's someone off the field. It's going to be the head coaches in my mind. I think when I look around the Big 12, there are so many really good head coaches, and there's so many guys that have been there for a really long time, guys that are rising stars in the industry, guys that have had really good moments in the past, have, kind of cooled off a little bit, but are looking for a resurgence. There's so many different things to watch in this conference. Obviously, the story of college football at a lot of the time is a head coach in this conference in Deion, but I want to start with Kyle Whittingham and Mike Gundy in particular, because those are two guys that are two of the most widely respected guys in all of the sport. They absolutely can do literally anything you need them to do. All they do is win games, and they've won them for probably about 20 years now. So they've been around as long as I have been alive, and they've been winning football games for as long as I've been alive. So very, very talented coaches there, obviously. They kind of lead the group, at least in my eyes. Then you have Lance Leipold and Chris Kleiman, the Kansas group that is just absolutely ridiculous. Both very, very high risers in this industry, and they seem very happy where they're at. So maybe they're not moving up anytime soon. Obviously, things change very quickly in the coaching world, but Lance Leipold just signed an extension. Chris Kleiman signed one, I think, a year or two ago. So there's some comfortability there, and the Kansas schools will be more than happy with their head coaches going forward. I feel fairly confident about that. But then you have the, Gus Malzahn's of the world, who actually, in fact, has the fourth highest winning percentage of any head coach in this group. So a very talented head coach in his own right, and absolutely is someone that could make some noise. And then you have Matt Campbell, you have Sonny Dykes, you have Dave Aranda, you do have Deion that could make some noise. All of these guys, have done good things in the past, whether it was at the current school that they're at or the one prior. They've been able to win a lot of football games, and it'll be really interesting to see if they're able to get that magic back. And Matt Campbell is the one that I'm watching most in particular, because he had a run there where he was the hottest name on the coaching market, and it's kind of cooled off a little bit, but the guy can still coach football. There's no two ways about that. But then you have guys like Willie Fritz, you have Neil Brown, you have Joey McGuire, all really remarkable guys that I think are starting to build up those programs into something that can be really, really successful. But then you have the Kenny Dillinghams of the world, Kalani Sitake, Brent Brennan, Scott Satterfield, who are all kind of towards the bottom, but I think are very, very capable coaches, and particularly Kenny Dillingham and Brent Brennan, I think will have winners in this league in some time in the future. So this is going to be really interesting, because all of these schools are very, very closely packed in this conference. That's why it's my favorite conference going into this year, and usually in those conferences, the adjustments made are the ones that make the difference. So the head coaches and really the coaching staff overall is going to be the deciding factor in the Big 12. I feel very confident about that. But then let's move over to the ACC, and it's all about the transfers. Let's be totally honest. The ACC, when you look across that conference, it's really hard to find continuity on most of those teams. You have Georgia Tech, you have SMU, you have Virginia Tech, but other than that, there is a lot of movement. I mean, Clemson is always going to be solid, but Cam Ward, Grayson McCall, Tyler Shuck coming in, DJ Uyunglele, all of those guys went on to teams that have their eyes set on an ACC title in 2024. There's no two ways about that. They are going to be defining this conference in just so many different ways this upcoming season. Obviously, Clemson with Cade Klubnik is one of the only teams the only team, frankly, in the top 5 preseason odds to win the conference with a returning quarterback. So very, very interesting. You also have guys, Haynes King at Georgia Tech, Preston Stone at SMU, Kyron Jones at Virginia Tech. So you do have some normal guys, but there are a lot of transfer quarterbacks in this group, but also it doesn't necessarily stop at transfer quarterbacks. You know, you have transfers across the field at so many different places. North Carolina State really leaned into it, got Jordan Waters and Noah Rogers on the offensive side of the ball. You also got Miami, who attacked the portal really as hard as anyone in the country. Florida State's almost entirety of their offense is a portal class with Malik Benson and Roydell Williams coming in. You have Louisville, who's going to be Louisville and bring in essentially everyone. Colin Lacey is someone that came over from South Florida at the wide receiver position for them. That is going to be really fascinating to watch this upcoming year. But overall, it's going to be really fascinating to watch how these teams unfold. But also, on top of all of this, when you talk about, DJ and you talk about all of the quarterbacks coming in and all of the changes, there's that one constant. There's the Clemson, who is the anti-portal team, the team that has not touched the portal with a 10-foot pole since it started. And it'll be really interesting to see, is Clemson going to win this conference and zig while everyone else is zagging and find a way to win this conference this upcoming year? So it's kind of that conversation of there's going to be transfers that decide this conference, who's going to win, and, maybe the transfers are the one that decide it, or it's Clemson's decision to not be a transfer team that decides this conference and they end up winning it and kind of making everyone else look dumb, frankly. So it'll be really interesting to watch that unfold. I think all of this stuff is really, really interesting every time because you never really know what's going to decide a conference, but it feels like those groups in particular are going to be really, really interesting to watch throughout the year. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to get back to Heisman Watch. We did the SEC yesterday. We're going to get into the Big Ten today, so definitely stick around for that, and we will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the groups that I think are going to define all the Power 4 conferences. It feels like there are a couple of groups within each conference that kind of stand out to me as the ones leading the way, the ones that will end up deciding who wins that conference. So that'll be really, really interesting to watch. But let's get into a little bit of a Heisman watch. We did the SEC yesterday. We're going to do the Big Ten today. And we're going to do 5 guys, 3 positions have to be included throughout this thing. So it's definitely a little bit of an interesting task because if I was ranking these normally, it'd likely be all 5 quarterbacks, to be totally honest. But the Big Ten is a really fun one because I had 4 different positions in this iteration. But we're going to start with a dark horse and then make our way through the top 5 as I see it. My dark horse is Miller Moss, and frankly, there's so many guys that I could have thrown here. Drew Aller felt like not enough of a dark horse being at Penn State, but also I don't necessarily love the guys that he's throwing to at Penn State. But he is Miller Moss in particular is definitely getting the Lincoln Riley bias, if you will. I definitely think that there's part of me that just says, if Lincoln Riley's coaching that quarterback, he's going to have really good numbers. And that's kind of just the way of the world. They have the ability to put up some really ridiculous stats if he can execute this offense. I think there is, a worry that this team is just not prepared for the physicality that is coming for them in the Big Ten. And maybe this offensive line isn't very strong and it makes things a little bit tough for him. But that was pretty much the case last year, and he diced up Louisville, which was a very, very good defense throughout last season. So it'll be really interesting to watch this kind of unfold. I think there is really an ability in this team to win 9 games, to maybe even win 10 games and get to a conference championship. There's also that ability to be 7-5 and be very disappointing, and it'll likely not be because of Miller Moss. And frankly, that might be the deciding factor in all of this, is how good is that defense. I don't think anyone has won the Heisman with. I don't think anyone that has won any less than 9 games, or their team has won any less than 9 games, has won the Heisman since Ricky Williams in '98. So it's likely not going to happen if they go 7-5 or 8-4. So a lot of this is kind of up to the defense to kind of help him out and make sure that his Heisman odds are intact throughout the season. But I think he's going to put up really good numbers. I think he's going to execute this offense really well. And if he does that, he's going to be in the mix as long as that defense can hold up. But let's move on to the top 5. And I want to start with Caleb Downs. This is a very interesting guy. We talked about him last week when we were talking about him possibly playing a little bit of running back, and that might actually be what he has to do to win the Heisman this upcoming year. But I'll say it as many times as people need to hear it. I think this is the best player in the country. What I saw last year from him at Bama was unlike anything I've ever seen. A freshman walking into that roster at that position group and leading them in tackles for the first time for anyone at Bama as a freshman since 1970, I think the 70s, sometime around there, is insane. This is a program that has been littered with really talented freshmen throughout the time, but this is the most talented I've seen. And Nick Saban pretty much said as much throughout the season. So I think he's going to be one of those guys that you can use all over the field. You can bring him down to the box, use him as a pseudo linebacker, and maybe rush the passer from time to time. He can drop back into coverage and make some plays. The issue is, I don't think he's necessarily going to have gaudy numbers when it comes to sacks or INTs or anything like that. He's going to have a ton of tackles, I can promise you that, but he won't necessarily have that full stat sheet that, some of the other guys will have when you're talking about the Heisman. So it'll be really fascinating to watch. I tend to believe if he's going to get it done, he's got to be a running back and score a couple of touchdowns on the offensive side of the ball. But at the end of the day, I think this guy is remarkably talented, and if anyone can break through that glass ceiling of a defensive player winning the Heisman again, it could be this kid. But then, number 4, I have Donovan Edwards. I understand that there are going to be some Ohio State fans that are not so happy that he is above the 2 Ohio State guys. It's frankly just because the 2 Ohio State guys have to split snaps with each other, and it makes it a lot tougher for them to get the numbers that they're going to need. And I've said this before on here, and I'll say it plenty of times throughout the season, I think. Donovan Edwards, in my eyes, is a better running back than Blake Corum. I think he has more of an ability to catch the ball out of the backfield. I think he has better breakaway speed, change of pace, elite balance. I think he's just a more complete running back, to be totally honest. So that's not taking anything away from Blake Corum. Also, Donovan Edwards is just that remarkable. I think this O-line is really going to be the key here. You're replacing tons of people. So if Sherrone Moore can do what he's been able to do, the last 5 years he's been at Michigan, there will be no problem there, but there is a little bit of a worry of the push that they're going to be able to get on the offensive line. But Edwards has a real opening here where he's going to be leaned on sometimes. Alex Orji is not necessarily the best passer. They're going to have to hand the ball off to him. In some games, it's going to have to be 30 times, and it's going to have to be really riding him to victory, and it'll be really interesting to watch that kind of unfold. But also, Alex Orji is a really good runner of the football, which open some running lanes for him. So there's an ability there that it's not only, how good I think he is, which is really good, but I also think, with the offense that Michigan is going to be running this year, he's going to have to be really good, to be totally honest. But number 3, I went back to the defensive side of the ball. Abdul Carter, I think, is an absolute game wrecker. I think when you look at this conference, there are a number of guys that on the defensive side of the ball that can make some noise. We just talked about one in Caleb Downs, but this guy is a little bit different. I think he can just straight up win you a game. We talked about JTT doing that to Penn State a couple of years back, and I think Abdul Carter is someone that could absolutely do that. They might just win a game 17-7 where he has 3 sacks, a forced fumble, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery, and he totally wins the game for Penn State. So he's one of those guys that's just an absolute nightmare. I don't think there's an offensive tackle that he is going to face throughout the season, at least that's on his schedule right now, that is going to be able to handle him. I think there's going to be guys that are going to be able to slow him down a little bit, but not stop him. I can almost promise you that. So it'll be fascinating to watch him. He's one of my favorite guys in the country, and especially if he starts to drop back into coverage and have a pick or two, things get really interesting. But let's get to the top two, and it starts with Will Howard. And I know this one's a little bit tough because there is that big time question of how good is he going to be at Ohio State? Is he going to be the quarterback that they all want him to be? But the reality is, if he executes this offense at a high level, he's going to be in that conversation. If they do the things that Ohio State is expecting to do this upcoming season, he will be in that conversation. And I think Chip Kelly may be the best thing that has ever happened to Will Howard, at least in terms of football, because his ability to employ the QB run game and the run game in general is truly second to none across the entire country, and Will Howard running the football is a pretty special thing, and that's really how you kind of unleash him and make him the best player that he possibly can be. The weapons at Ohio State are Ohio State weapons. That's never going to be a problem. Emeka Egbuka, Jeremiah Smith, Brendan Ennis, Carnell Tate, Travion Henderson, and Quinshon Judkins, the best running back duo in the entire country, so there's plenty to work with there. The offensive line should be more solid than it was a year ago. If it's not, then we have a very interesting conversation to be had. But at the end of the day, I think Will Howard has more ability than he's being given credit for. I think he definitely has the ability to execute this offense at a really high level. And is he going to put up Heisman numbers? I don't know, but he's going to put up really, really good numbers if he's able to do that. So he would join, that he would be the first quarterback from Ohio State to win the Heisman since Troy Smith. It would be a very, very interesting thing to watch. And frankly, with all the quarterbacks that have come through Ohio State, it's pretty remarkable that that's the case anyway. But finally, Dillon Gabriel's number one, and frankly, I hate when people do this, but frankly, to me, it's not even close. I think this guy has the ability to win the conference, and when you're at Oregon, you're going to be firmly in the conversation if you do that. Bo Nix, we saw last year, was absolutely in the conversation for that down the stretch, and the weapons are insane. Tez Johnson, Evan Stewart, Gary Bryant Jr., Traytron Holden is what we would call an embarrassment of riches for quarterbacks. They have everything you could possibly want on the receiving core. Terrence Ferguson is a fantastic receiving tight end, so it's just ridiculous what they're going to be able to do on the offensive side of the ball. And I think one of the really cool things about Dillon Gabriel is he puts the ball right where it needs to be. He's not going to be inaccurate. He might, make a couple of mistakes here. He might throw a pick from time to time, but one of the things he's not going to do is be under 65% completion percentage. The guy is going to put the ball on the receivers, and when you have the guys that he does around him, that's really all you have to do. The O-line is going to be one of the best in the country, almost with no question about that. You have a Johnny Harris and Josh Connerly are the second best offensive tackle duo in the country, in my opinion, behind LSU with Will Campbell and John Emery Jr., just ridiculous down there. But Matthew Bedford coming in from Indiana is an absolute force on the inside. And then add on top of all of this, Will Stein's offense and Dillon Gabriel's style of play, I think, is just puzzle pieces. I think it's going to work just beautifully. Obviously, the quarterback run game won't be quite as intense as it was a year ago, but it doesn't mean Dillon Gabriel can't scoot. The dude can get going if he needs to, so I definitely am very excited to see how all of that unfolds. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a fascinating thing to watch. The Big Ten is not necessarily the group that I would say the Heisman Trophy winner is going to come out of, but at the end of the day, there's plenty of guys that could make some noise if they can execute their offense at a really, really high level. So very excited to see all of that unfold, but let's take our final break here. And when we come back, we're going to do a Top 10 Tuesday, and it's going to be fairly contentious. I'm going to break down what I think are the best rivalries in college football, go 10-1, and I think my one pick is going to make some people mad, but we'll get there when we get there. So definitely stick with us, and we'll be right back with that. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different guys that I think could win the Heisman out of the Big Ten. We'll go through all of the conferences throughout the week, get to, I think, the Big 12 probably tomorrow, and then the ACC to finish it out on Thursday. But now I want to get to a Top 10 Tuesday, and it's going to be a contentious one. I can almost feel it. The best rivalries in college football is one that is a battle that people have been fighting for quite some time, and it is one that I've had a pretty firm take on for quite some time, but I wanted to get it out there. I've done a segment on what I think the best one is, but we'll get to that at the very end. Let's start to break this down, and I think for me it starts Alabama-Tennessee. I think this is one that, third Saturday in October, this one is just special. You have the cigar smoke that fills the stadium after the game. It's always a really fun game, even, in a era where Tennessee's kind of getting abused a little bit, at least in the past, decade with Bama's run. But the reality is, no matter what, every single time, this one has energy around it. Even if Bama's coming in totally undefeated and Tennessee's coming in kind of limping, this one still has juice. And frankly, I think both of these programs are going in a direction where it's going to get more interesting. I think Bama's taking, not a huge step back by any means, which is actually something I want to get into tomorrow. But I think Tennessee is taking steps forward. So this rivalry not only is great right now, but I think could get even better throughout the next couple of years. Then I got Florida State, Florida. I think this is obviously one that's just incredible. When you go look back at last year in Gainesville, it was special. That place was absolutely incredible all throughout that game, and especially down the stretch of that game when they were, trying to win a really tough one. It was just off the walls wild. These are two programs that have pretty much as much history as really anyone. They both have been at the mountaintops. They both climbed over each other to get there. And they did it really actually pretty close to each other where, Florida won in 08, 09, and then you had Florida State at the very top in 2013 and 2014 right back in the playoffs. So these teams have been in the conversation not too long ago, and I think they will be for quite some time to come. Obviously, Florida going through kind of a tough stretch right now, but I think they'll be able to find their footing at least in the next 3 to 5 years, and this game will get back to being what it should be, which is one of the biggest games of the entire year. And then I had Notre Dame USC. Colin Cowherd is wrong. This game should be played forever. There's no two ways about that. These are two programs that are as iconic as they get. They are blue bloods, and they are just incredible. And they always play in iconic stadiums, whether it's USC out there in the Coliseum or it's Notre Dame Stadium. Those are two really, really special places to play, and these two uniforms playing on those fields is always a really cool thing to watch. So there's always going to be a little bit of intensity, a little bit faster play, both teams just playing a little bit harder, and hopefully at some point it's maybe even a conference rivalry in the Big Ten at some point, but Notre Dame's holding out pretty aggressively to be that standalone independent. But let's move on here. Texas A&M is one that some of you might be a little bit unaware of. If you're a little bit on the younger side, frankly, I very barely remember this one, if I'm being totally honest. But I know what this one's about because I am firmly in the camp of, I've talked about this on here before. I grew up a Texas fan, so I have, experienced a lot of the conversations between these two fan bases, and they hate each other. They don't just hate the other team. They hate everything about what the other fan base is and the people that they are. It's absolutely insane. So the atmosphere in this one this year is going to shock some people. And frankly, I think Kyle Field should look into possibly reinforcing some of the parts of their stadium, some of the foundation, because it's going to be absolutely insane in that stadium. There's no two ways about that. And then you had Florida State, Miami. I think this one takes the cake over Florida State, Florida to me because it's a conference battle, because they have that, incredible history of battling in the same conference for quite some time, and two programs that have so much history and hatred and a million iconic players throughout their history. So I love all of the Florida rivalries. I think they're all really, really incredible games, whether it's Florida State Miami or Florida State Florida, Florida Miami. I think they're all really, really awesome, but this one takes the cake to me, if I'm being totally honest. But let's get to the top 5, and these are the special ones, in my opinion. The largest outdoor cocktail party is one that is just different. It's one of the ones that I've been to on this list. Georgia, Florida is one of those when you step into the stadium, it is special. You feel that energy, even, in a stadium that is an NFL stadium, in a city that neither of the schools are quartered out of. It's still wild. And obviously this one has leaned a little bit more toward Georgia's direction recently, but it doesn't change that Florida fans walk in there with a ton of confidence, walk in there with a ton of energy, and it's going to be really, really incredible to watch this kind of develop, because although Florida is going through a rough patch like we just talked about, I think they find their footing, and I think this game becomes what the Florida State-Florida one should be, which is one of the biggest games in the entire year. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. Then I got Army-Navy. This one's always special. This is the history, 2 programs, the 2 schools in particular. The people playing in this game are special people. I think we can all agree on that. Formerly, it was on a standalone weekend. It should be on a standalone weekend, but that's beside the point. This one is just different than any other game. I think every time you have the Army-Navy game, you know that probably 90% of college football fans are going to be tuned in, and probably 90% of those people have no interest in who wins, really. They don't necessarily care if it's Army or if it's Navy. They just want to see good football, and they want to watch this game as a standalone game on that Saturday because it's a really special one, not only because of what happens on the field, but because of who these people are off the field, but also the just majesty around this one is just remarkable. But let's jump into the top 3 here, and I got the Iron Bowl at 3. I think this one is the battle in Alabama is obviously going to be huge, and football is life in Alabama. I can promise you that. These 2 fan bases hate each other just so aggressively. The history between them is as for real as it gets. I remember Bama fans, burning down Toomer's corner over there in Auburn. There have been just some really remarkable things that have happened throughout this rivalry, but also on the field, it's been just insane. The kick 6 was one of the greatest endings that we've ever seen. Obviously, last year, even 4th and 31 was just ridiculous. So it always gives us those great endings. Bryce Young had a very, very incredible drive to end one of those games, his final year. So it's just wild what this game gives us every single year. So Auburn just never lets Bama off easy, and that's what always makes for a good rivalry game. So absolutely love that one. The game I have at number 2, and I feel like people are realizing what I have at number 1. But Ohio State and Michigan checks almost every single box when you talk about a rivalry game. The historic programs, 2 blue bloods, the atmosphere is ridiculous. The unadulterated hate of just crossing out M's for an entire month around Columbus is just insane. It's all college football. It's all absolutely beautiful. I think this game always has stakes as well, which is another huge draw to this game, where every single year, they break down the biggest games that will define the college football playoff. This is always in the top 3 or 4 because it's so important, because it usually decides who goes to the Big Ten championship and who maybe makes it to the playoff. So it's one of those games that not only are they, crazy games that are really intense, but it's between 2 teams that have a ton riding on the season, at least the majority of the time. Sometimes it's Ohio State running away with the thing and Michigan trying to play spoiler. Sometimes it's the other way around. It's very rarely been the other way around, frankly, but this one's just awesome and will forever be iconic. I think, frankly, I'd argue it's getting into what is going to be its heyday, because I think Michigan is finding its way up. I think they're going to be a program that is going to be right at the top for a very, very long time because of the way that they've built that program. And Ohio State's Ohio State. They're going to be in the conversation most years, and this one is going to be as intense as you've ever seen it over the next decade. I feel fairly confident about that, if I'm being totally honest. But then, number 1, Red River rivalry, and I've done this take on here. If you want to go see my full take, it's somewhere on the Hot Take Thursday segment throughout the page, but this one's special. I'll be totally honest. I think this one is just absolutely different. And frankly, I don't think this will be a hot take 2 or 3 years down the road once we see it around, once SEC fans see it and once we see it on national television as an SEC game. I don't think people will question that this is the best rivalry in the sport. And there's so many different reasons why it's special, but the one that I zero in on the Hot Take Thursday, and the one that I really want to talk about right now, is the atmosphere around this game is different than any other football game played in any other place ever. Truly, it's totally different. The 50-50 split at the 50-yard line is something that doesn't happen in any other college football game, or really any other football game. The Texas Fair right outside, where literally Josh Pate tells stories about how he walked out the door, got a funnel cake at halftime, and then walked back in, watched the second half of what was an incredible game where Caleb Williams came to life for Oklahoma. So this one is just different inside and outside the stadium. So I think when you talk about all of the rivalries across college football, you talk about all the incredible ones, and there are ones that, year over year have had higher stakes than this one because Texas has not been that great of a team over the last decade or so. But the reality is this one is still special every single year. It still gives us so much every single year, and there's never a game that is decided by a ton of points. Obviously, there are anomalies here and there, but for the majority, there are games that are decided by 3, decided by 7, decided by 4. It's incredible what these two teams have in the tank when they walk into that stadium, and it's going to be special for a really long time. These two programs going into the SEC, becoming better by the day pretty much. I think it's going to be just insane over the next couple of years. So I understand that people are going to be a little bit against me on that, but the Red River Showdown, the Red River rivalry, the Red River, whatever you want to call it, it's special. It's totally different than whatever else we have in college football, and frankly, it is as unadulterated of an atmosphere in college football as I can possibly find. If I was trying to define college football in one picture, in one atmosphere, it would be there. There's no doubt in my mind. So obviously that's going to be a take that people don't love, but at the end of the day, I think that one's the most special, not only because of what happens on the field, but because of the atmosphere that surrounds it. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content updates you could possibly need. We just have incredible people doing really, really good work across every single sport you could possibly want. So come on over to GSMC. We have you totally covered in the world of sports. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.